And we begin this Sunday morning with President Trump's economic agenda as we get new clarity on the year ahead. And affordability takes center stage for the upcoming election year. New data from the Labor Department shows the U.S. economy added 119,000 jobs in the month of September, more than doubling expectations, ahead of more inflation data coming up this upcoming week. With the president telling me exclusively last month, investment into America could total $20 trillion by the end of this year on his watch. The Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, met with the president in the Oval Office last week, and he increased his investment into the U.S. to some $1 trillion next year, up from the initial $600 billion promised earlier by the de facto leader of the Saudi kingdom. All of this as the White House awaits the Supreme Court decision on President Trump's use of tariffs, expected soon. Now, if the Supreme Court rules against the Trump administration, the U.S. may have to pay back approximately $200 billion in tariff revenue, which has already been collected from importers. But Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, with me here last weekend, said he's not expecting a negative ruling, and he looks for a strong economy next year as the impact of the big, beautiful bill takes effect.
I think we are going to see a substantial acceleration in the economy in the second quarter, and I think we are also we're already seeing on many prices. As I said, we're bending that curve down, and the increase in real incomes. I think Americans are going to feel it in the first quarter, second quarter. I think 2026. Thanks to President Trump's signature plans, is going to be a great year for working Americans, for the markets.
President Trump is also floating the idea of sending out $2,000 rebate checks from tariff revenue. But some Republican lawmakers are pushing back at the proposal over concerns the money could cause another spike in inflation and could be better used to pay down debt, which, of course, is now above $38 trillion. Partly due to the $7 trillion in unchecked new spending by the Biden administration. That, of course, caused inflation to spike to 40-year highs of 21.5% under Joe Biden's 4 years in the Oval Office. Joining me now in this Sunday Morning Futures exclusive is the National Economic Council Director, Kevin Hassett. Director Kevin Hassett, great to see you. Thank you for being here this morning. And to you, happy Thanksgiving, and we've got a lot to be grateful for. I want to get your take on what you're expecting for the new year, 2026, in the economy. What does that look like to you today?
Right. It's going to be an absolute blockbuster year ahead. And one of the signals you just mentioned, the jobs report, that was double the expectation, a blowout jobs report. We've got GDP now for the last 2 quarters, almost 4% on average, maybe even a little bit above. And we're going to have a little bit of a hiccup in the fourth quarter because of the silly shutdown. But then things are really lifting off. And the fun thing, Maria, is that in the jobs report, you could already see it. That my staff tells me that in September and October, there have been more than 20 groundbreakings by major corporations to build new factories because President Trump said, let's expense those factories. Let's get those factories building. And then we saw in September a big surge in construction workers because they got to go build those factories. But the good news for the next year is that the factories are going to be in place, and then people are going to start getting the jobs next to the machines and everything else. And so it really, really is a very, very promising set of data. And the only thing is that we're going to see a lot of whining from left-wing critics of the president about the fourth quarter, because our estimate is that the shutdown cost more than we expected at the beginning because it had such a huge effect on this week ahead. So many people had to cancel their Thanksgiving plans because of the Democrats' shutdown that we think the economic effect might be to cut economic growth about in half for the fourth quarter.
So you're talking about what, 1% growth in the fourth quarter? How would you assess what the...
I would say 1.5 or 2, yeah, 1.5 or 2. But we're coming off a base of Trump growth of 4, and so subtract 1.5. That's how we get it.
Now, I know that there are a lot of positives here that you just mentioned, particularly related to what President Trump is doing, getting the supply chains back to America. But the issue of affordability is front and center now. Going into next year, there are some things that are up in price, like the price of beef, some food items. What do you want to say about these bumps in certain prices and your efforts to rein in inflation?
Well, the first thing we want to say is that we 100% get it. And one of the ways you can think about it, Maria, is that because of inflation and the 4% increase in mortgage rates for the typical home buyer, the mortgage rate, the monthly payment, went from about $1,200 to about $2,500 during the Biden administration. And so if you add up the increase in the price of groceries, the 21% that you mentioned, that means that a typical ordinary family had to spend $25,000 more every year just to cover the Biden inflation. And President Trump is closing the gap on that fast. We've got, no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, a big reduction in the deficit, so the macroeconomic effect of inflation is going down as well, and potentially new leadership at the Fed, which is going to cut interest rates. But there's all above approach on affordability, but we understand why people feel like they haven't caught up yet because of the huge hole that was dug by Joe Biden.
And of course, we know that you are on the short list to become potentially the next chairman of the Federal Reserve. I know you don't like to talk about that much, but you are on that list. When do you expect the president to tell us who he's chosen for the next chairman of the Fed job?
I think that the president is expecting to interview final candidates sometime over the next couple of months, and then we'll probably have a decision sometime soon around the new year.
So by end of year or new year, we'll know who's the next chairman of the Fed.
The president will do what he wants to do, though, I got to say, as you know.
Of course.
So it could be tomorrow. It could be tomorrow.
Would you expect that 2026 is a year of lowered interest rates?
Yes, I think that the big difference between the high growth from President Trump and the high growth we get sometimes from Democrats is that our growth comes from supply side policies that build factories, the 20 trillion that you're mentioning, and when there's a big increase in supply, that drives down prices. And so we had really runaway growth before COVID and the Trump administration, more than $6,000 for the typical family and extra income, and inflation in the 1% range. And that's what we expect we're going to see again because of all the positive supply side policies for the big beautiful bill and the tariff revenue reducing the deficit and so on.
Kevin, we know that China has been tough to negotiate with, and over the last couple of weeks, we're hearing even more pushback from the Chinese Communist Party. The Wall Street Journal reported that the CCP is not going to send the rare earth minerals that are so needed in this country. They're not going to send it to companies that are tied to the U.S. military. That's exactly where we need the rare earths to go, and they're cutting them off. We hear, according to the Journal, the Financial Times is also reporting about other aggression from the CCP. What can you tell us about those rare earth minerals and the flow and where you are in your China dealings?
Well, I got to say that President Xi and President Trump have a very strong relationship. And one of the things that I've seen happen, and this is just, Kevin Hassett as observer now, Maria, I've known you for 25 years, is that it feels like sometimes there's people in the Chinese government that don't understand what President Xi wants. And then we get back to President Xi and say, did you notice your guys were doing this? And then they stop. And so our hope is still that the deal that was made is a solid deal that they'll continue to adhere to. But don't forget that the rare earths problem is being solved rapidly by President Trump's policy, which is basically almost like a warp speed policy for rare earths. And you might have seen on TV this week that Secretary Bassett actually held a magnet made in the U.S. He said it might have been the first one that's already being produced because we recognize that we don't want to be held hostage again.
That is incredible. So you believe that we are going to actually start doing this organically ourselves so that we don't have to rely on China. How long will that process take so that we are actually independent of producing our own rare earth minerals and refining those minerals in America?
Well, it takes a while to get these refineries going, but we've got lots of allies that are working on this. And we also have a collegial relationship, we believe, with China after the last meeting. And so I think that we have time to keep our economy running and to move towards a place where there's a more global supply of rare earths. I don't think that, frankly, any country should have a monopoly on anything because, countries have problems sometimes. And then all of a sudden the whole world is disrupted. And so I think it's great for the long-run economy, for the safety of all economies, for us to diversify the production of these things.
And let me get your take on the SCOTUS decision. We're waiting on the Supreme Court to have a ruling on whether or not the president can use the emergency reason to issue these tariffs. When are you expecting that decision, and what are you expecting?
I don't know when the decision's coming, but I can tell you that the decision depends on two things where I think the ground is as solid as it could be for us. One is it an emergency? Because we have emergency authorities. And if you think about all the deaths from fentanyl, the deaths of despair that Nobel Prize-winning economist Angus Deaton wrote about from the places where trade shut down factories and closed down basically towns and villages. So the emergency case is solid. And then the next case is, well, can we use the tariffs? But the law says that we're allowed to regulate trade. And if you're going to regulate trade, then you could even either use a quota, an embargo, or a tariff. Those are the three things that you could do. And if you take a quota and auction it off, then it's mathematically the same as a tariff, and nobody thinks you couldn't do a quota. And so I think that logically we're about as solid as you could possibly be on both fronts.
All right, real quick before you go, the president wants to send out $2,000 stimulus checks. An analyst at Piper Sandler tells his clients this is unlikely. What are the odds we see those $2,000 checks go out next year?
Well, never underestimate President Trump, but in a time when we're being thankful for everything, don't forget, Maria, that we sent out $2,000 about checks already to everybody who has overtime or has tip income. And so President Trump wants to help fix the problem, fill the hole that Joe Biden created. And if we have the money, if the money keeps coming in, we're running a surplus right now over the last few months, then I'm sure that he'll be looking into that.
All right, we will see how that plays out. Good to talk with you, Kevin Hassett. Thank you.
You too, Maria.
National Economic Council Director Kevin Hassett, happy Thanksgiving to you and family.
I'm Steve Ducey.
I'm Brian Kilmeade.
And I'm Ainsley Earhart. And click here to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page to catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis.